Uh-oh guys, veganism has been debunked. Crop deaths, soy in the rainforest, global shipping of plant foods, insecticides, resource-intense plant crops like almonds, supporting non-vegan companies, living in a non-vegan world, avocados, quinoa, cashews.
See, veganism is imperfect. Hashtag super flawed.
These are a few things that people point to when they say that veganism isn't perfect and that they use as an excuse to not go vegan themselves, but are any of them actually a good excuse? Spoiler alert, nope. But what is interesting and equally terrible about these excuses is that on the surface, they really do seem like potentially good and logical reasons to question veganism. Like they sound good at first, especially to a non-vegan who hasn't done any real research into the topic. So let's just talk generally speaking first though. Here's what is true. Veganism is not perfect. I mean, when you start living a vegan lifestyle, you don't become this perfect being that causes no harm at all. I mean, simply by existing, you will cause harm. And just because you're causing less harm in this area of your life by being vegan, that doesn't mean that you're perfect in other aspects of your life either. But deciding that a solution like veganism isn't worth it because it isn't perfect is actually a logical fallacy known as the nirvana fallacy or the perfect solution fallacy. A good description of this can be found on logicallyfallacious.com, the nirvana fallacy, comparing a realistic solution with an idealized one and discounting or even dismissing the realistic solution as a result of comparing to a perfect world or impossible standard, ignoring the fact that improvements are often good enough reason. Imagine way back in the day that someone was arguing for murder to be considered a crime and then wanting there to be punishments for those who murder, and then there was someone else saying,
well, just because you make murder illegal and punishable, that doesn't mean all murder will stop. So we should just make murder legal.
Obviously today, even though murder is illegal and punishable, it does still happen. So making it illegal and punishable isn't a perfect solution that ends all murder across the planet, but it doesn't mean that it isn't better than the alternative of making murder totally legal. A solution doesn't have to be perfect in order for it to be something worth pursuing. If you're sitting here thinking, well, I do care about animal suffering or environmental damage or human suffering, but you won't pursue veganism because it's not perfect, then you absolutely also must stop eating animals and paying for them to be exploited too, because that solution isn't perfect either. In fact, it's much more imperfect than veganism. You'll never be perfect. I'll never be perfect. That's not at all what veganism is about. As activists, we aren't out on the streets telling people that they should become vegan because when they do, they'll become free of harm and become angels or something like that. Instead, we're just acknowledging that there are serious issues on this planet that we're causing, like trillions of animals are being killed needlessly every single year. Our planet is being destroyed, and there's a lot of unnecessary human suffering that's caused by these industries as well. Veganism will not eliminate all of this entirely, especially just by itself, but it is the best solution that we have right now, and in many cases is about as perfect as we could get, especially with the population size that we have. So even though veganism isn't 100% perfect, it is 100% worth pursuing. Now the exception to this would be if any of these excuses or imperfections that are brought up actually meant that veganism caused more harm or more suffering or more damage. So let's run through these excuses really quick to see if that's true, and let's start with soy in the rainforest. You know, many vegans or environmentalists will talk about how veganism is better for the rainforest and talk about how animal agriculture is the leading cause of deforestation on this planet and causes up to 91% of the rainforest destruction. So that's what vegans will say, but then a non-vegan will come in and say something like,
well, actually, one of the biggest things destroying the rainforest is soy crops. And who eats more soy than you tofu-loving hippies? No one. That's who.
So who's right? Well, both. Partially at least. Soy is one of the major crops that's grown on rainforest land after destroying it. See, this is like a perfect example of one of those excuses that at least on the surface seems like, oh wow, see, veganism's actually worse, but just hold on. Who's actually eating the soy though? Are they leveling and burning the rainforest down just to feed soy to the 2 to 3% of the population that identifies as vegans? No, the vast majority of soy crop is fed directly to animals that people eat, so it's feed crops. And that's estimated to be around 70 to 80% at least of the global soy production. The next largest chunk of soy is also not fed directly to humans, it's used for fuel and industrial products. And it's estimated that only around 6% of soy that's produced is directly consumed by humans, and of course, that isn't just vegans that are eating soy. So eating animals is what's causing the deforestation mostly on this planet, and by a very large margin. And even if soy, for humans to eat directly was a main culprit here, You don't have to eat soy to be a vegan. There are many vegans who are even allergic to soy, so it's definitely not a necessity here.
Okay, well, you got me on the soy point, but veganism actually kills more animals and living beings because of crop deaths and insecticides. Do you even know how many animals are killed in those plants you eat? Like, what, you don't care about field mice or what?
This is another one that, again, on the surface sounds like such a good point, but then ends up actually being a great argument in favor of veganism. If eating plants actually caused more animal death because of crop deaths and insecticides, then yes, this would absolutely hurt veganism, at least in the terms of diet, because we would want to avoid causing more animal suffering and death. But eating animals actually causes more crop deaths, more insecticide use, and more plant deaths while we're at it too. Here's a chart of how many estimated animal deaths there are per 1 million calories produced for a few different foods. Now, as you can see, plant products are at the very bottom of this list. Now, why is this? Well, the majority of our crops, just like in the soy rainforest example, are not eaten by humans directly, but instead are fed to the animals that people eat. Eating a plant-based vegan diet would lessen the number of crops needed for farming, since you can feed up to 14 times more people on a plant-based diet for the same amount of land. That means that less crop deaths would happen, less insecticides would be used, and less plant deaths would happen too. So if you care about mice, bugs, or plant suffering, then veganism is still the best option. It's not perfect, but by far the best. It's also worth noting that the only solution that really could be like essentially perfect here would be veganism and things like veganic or vertical farms, where you could potentially have the least amount of suffering and potentially little or maybe even zero animal or insect death.
Okay, well, even though it's less plants, those plants still have to be shipped all around the world, and that causes more environmental damage. Eating local beef is better than eating an avocado flown from halfway around the globe, not to mention that some of those foods like avocado and quinoa cause a ton of human suffering too.
People love to say this, and again, it may sound logical at first, like, oh yeah, I mean, planes are bad for the environment, and if I just eat a cow from my backyard, that's better than using planes, right? Well, no, probably not, which I'll explain, but also first, this isn't what's happening, so it's somewhat irrelevant. People aren't eating local animal products and then only eating veggies that were like imported from around the world. As an example, over 3.3 billion pounds of beef were imported into the US in 2020, which is up 9% from 2019. 3 billion pounds. And it comes from all over the world, including Australia, Honduras, Brazil, Japan, etc. So comparing veganism to something that's not actually happening, that you aren't actually doing or funding, is pretty disingenuous even if you aren't doing it intentionally. And let's just say that you were the person who only buys locally killed animals. Well, ethically speaking, first of all, that still won't reduce animal harm and exploitation. Even factory farms are local to someone. Where an animal is killed geographically makes no difference to the animal. But also, this doesn't actually look at the whole picture when it comes to the resources needed or the environmental impact. All you're looking at here is the last step in the process, which is transportation. This fails to examine the much larger part of the process, which is, has a much larger impact on the environment, which is how many resources it takes to produce the food in the first place. And growing even some of the most intense plant crops still can require a lot less resources like land and water, still produce less greenhouse gases, and have less of an environmental impact than even locally raised animals, because animals are so resource intensive. And again, an even more important point here is similar to the one that I made with soy. This is a false dichotomy. You don't have to choose plants from around the globe or local meat. You don't have to eat avocados from around the world to be a vegan. You can eat local plants. And if everyone switched to being vegan, we don't have to replace all of these animal calories that are consumed with foods like globally shipped avocado and quinoa. That point also means when people talk about how harmful certain crops can be to humans, like the same logic applies here. People like to bring up some of the harmful practices or effects from avocados from Mexico or quinoa from Peru and Bolivia. I'm not gonna spend a ton of time debunking this because, one, it's been done like a million times, and I'll just link some videos below if I can remember to do that. But again, the most important point here is that even if these things were problems, these foods are not vegan specific, like it's not just vegans eating these foods, and it's not required for the world to be vegan. A good example of this is cashews. Like we've recently been trying to avoid cashews or find ethical cashews, but honestly that's pretty tough because they aren't usually labeled fair trade or anything. And cashew farming seems to be pretty messed up because it can burn the workers' hands and such, and it just doesn't really seem like the best option. But again, like no one plant food is required to be a vegan, so you can just try to avoid it like we do.
Okay. I think I know what you were going to say to this one, but some plants are terrible for the environment too, like almonds use a ton of water.
Yeah, some plant crops are more resource intensive than others for sure. Again, you can just choose other ones. This is one of the reasons that we choose to eat soy or oat milk instead of eating almond milk. And also almond milk just doesn't taste as good to me personally. But also, even though almond milk uses more water than oat or soy, it still uses much less water than cow's milk. I mean, people love to get all defensive because they hear a story about almond milk and other almond products being so intensive, and then they just use it as a justification to continue drinking cow's milk or eat cow's cheese, but that makes no sense because almond products still use less water than their animal counterparts. And it's not just water either. Plant milks, even including almond milk, are also better for land use and greenhouse gas emissions too.
All right, I feel like I'm really grasping at straws here, but I just know veganism sucks. So what about the fact that when you buy vegan products from non-vegan companies, the money is still going to be used for killing more animals? And I mean, we just don't live in a vegan world, so yeah.
Yeah, you actually bring up a good point here.
Wait, really?
Well, sort of. It's not a good reason to not be vegan, but it is worth thinking about, and if you are vegan already, it's definitely worth considering where you're buying your products from. I mean, and there's a lot of debate around this too, so I'm not gonna claim to have all of the answers or to be perfect or to have the perfect solution here, but you are right. You know, we don't live in a perfect world or a vegan world for that matter. So again, like our money is going to possibly go towards things that we don't support sometimes. And we should try to do our best to avoid that, but supply and demand doesn't really work that way either. As an example, I used to have a house painting business, and if people kept telling me that all they wanted to buy was the best paint for their house, I wouldn't keep buying a bunch of the lowest quality paint because it wouldn't sell. Or I guess more accurately, Sherwin-Williams wouldn't keep making cheap paint because it wouldn't sell. But it may take a very long time, or at least a while, to actually have this change happen or even be noticed. It's gonna take a majority of the customers changing their habits for Sherwin-Williams to realize this and to make these changes. And when you go vegan individually, it isn't going to shut down a factory farm the next day, but it is a part of the overall change that needs to happen because overall, a bunch of people will need to go vegan and stop buying these products to have these changes happen. You know, we are starting to see this too, not factory farms shutting down at scale yet, unfortunately, or even animal slaughter numbers decreasing yet either, but we are seeing growth in vegan products and industries, and this is a step in the right direction. And if more and more people change, eventually the slaughter numbers will decrease too. It's also important to remember that businesses, especially really large corporations, can't just change everything on a dime. They're not gonna change everything within a month. Often, they can't even make significant changes within a couple of years because there are a lot of systems that are in place that would be effective. So it's going to take time, but you can be a part of that change even though you just becoming vegan yourself isn't going to stop all slaughterhouses tomorrow. Again, a solution doesn't have to be perfect in order for it to be better and for it to be worth pursuing. If you were a slave owner back in the day and you thought it would be better for you to free your slaves because you were against slavery, then you should free your slaves even though it wouldn't end worldwide slavery the next day. I mean, some of my tax money is used for subsidies to kill animals for food. So me being vegan personally hasn't ended that. So again, it's not perfect, but if everyone was vegan or if even a majority of people were, then these subsidies would be shifted towards other more ethical options. And that can't happen if people aren't going vegan. So it's not perfect, but I'm doing what I can right now to try and make it as good as it can be, and you can do the same. So yeah, veganism isn't perfect. And it never will be. No solution will ever be perfect, but most of the things that people point to about how veganism is imperfect actually end up being arguments that strengthen the position of veganism, like crop deaths and the other ones that we discussed today. If you found this video valuable, then make sure you like it and share it with a friend. Don't forget to subscribe, and until next time, stop looking at what you can't do and start looking at what you can do. Thanks.